The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the sound. It was steady, methodical, and close like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. As I blinked the haze from my eyes, I realized it was coming from a monitor at my bedside. My mouth felt dry, like I hadn't spoken in days, and my arms were heavy, strapped down by invisible weights. The room was dim, the faint glow of the machines casting long shadows on sterile walls. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't put your finger on but settles in your gut like a stone. I tried to remember how I got here, what had happened before I blacked out, but my memory was patchy, like a half-forgotten dream. Then she walked in, the nurse. Her smile was polite, professional, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite figure out. She glanced at the clipboard in her hand before speaking. "Good morning, Mr. Emerson. How are you feeling?" It took me a second to process her words. "Mr. Emerson?" My voice came out weaker than I expected, barely a whisper. She paused, just for a moment, before her expression smoothed over. "Don't worry," she said, her voice soothing. "You've just had a little procedure. It's normal to feel disoriented." My gaze drifted down to my wrist. The ID bracelet glinted in the light. James Emerson. I stared at it, my heartbeat quickening, my mind scrambling for answers. That wasn't my name. My name was... The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the silence like a jagged edge. The voice that followed was distorted, warbled, as though it didn't belong to a person at all. "Room 24, patient discrepancy." The nurse froze. Her calm demeanor faltered, just for a second, before she forced a smile back onto her face. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice tighter now. She didn't meet my eyes as she left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. I was alone again, staring at the name on the bracelet. The beeping of the monitor sounded louder now, each beat marking the seconds I had left to figure out what was going on. I stared at the door long after the nurse left, her absence leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. My thoughts were sluggish, like moving through thick syrup, but one thing cut through the fog with sharp clarity. I am not James Emerson. I closed my eyes and tried to pull together the pieces of who I was. My name was Williams Morgan. I worked somewhere. Did I have a family, a partner? My memories felt like they'd been ransacked, shelves emptied, and only fragments left behind. The monitor beeped steadily beside me, the only sound in the room. The hospital itself felt too still, like it had been paused in the middle of a breath. I strained to hear anything: footsteps, distant voices, but all I caught was the faint creak of something metallic, like a gurney wheel rolling over uneven tiles. It was close but never seemed to arrive. The door opened again. This time, the nurse returned, accompanied by a man in a white coat. The doctor. His face was calm, reassuring, the practiced kind of expression you'd expect from someone used to dealing with distressed patients. "How are we feeling, Mr. Emerson?" he asked, glancing at my chart. I sat up a little, ignoring the tug of the IV in my arm. "My name's not Emerson," I said, my voice more firm this time. The nurse and doctor exchanged a quick glance, so fleeting I might have missed it if I wasn't watching. The doctor placed a hand on the edge of my bed, leaning in slightly. "You've been through quite a lot. Anesthesia can sometimes cause confusion, temporary amnesia even. Give it some time. These things usually sort themselves out." His tone was patient, professional, but I could hear the dismissal underneath it. "I'm telling you," I said, gripping the edge of the blanket tighter. "I know who I am. Check my records, my ID bracelet." "Your bracelet is correct," the nurse interrupted smoothly. Her voice had that same practiced calm, but her eyes darted toward the door like she wanted to be anywhere but here. Before I could argue further, there was a soft knock on the door. The nurse opened it, and a group of people shuffled in. A man, a woman, and a young girl. I froze. I didn't recognize any of them. "James!" the woman cried, her face lighting up as if she'd just found something precious she thought she'd lost. She rushed to my bedside, grabbing my hand in hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, unnaturally so, and I instinctively tried to pull away, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "I was so worried," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought we'd lost you." The man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked vaguely familiar but utterly alien at the same time, placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's good to see you awake, son." The girl, no older than 10, stood at the foot of the bed, staring at me with wide, glassy eyes. She didn't say a word, but her gaze felt heavy, like she was looking through me, not at me. I think there's been a mistake," I stammered, glancing from one face to another. "I don't know any of you." The woman's expression faltered, but only for a moment. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. "Just rest now. You'll understand soon." Her breath brushed against my ear, cold as her hand, and I caught a faint, metallic smell beneath her perfume. It turned my stomach, and I fought the urge to recoil. The man patted my shoulder again, his grip lingering a second too long. "We're here now. That's all that matters." They stayed for a while, talking to me like I was supposed to know them. The woman told me about our home, the dog I apparently loved, and how I'd been such a fighter through my recovery. The man chimed in occasionally, his deep voice filling the room, while the girl just stood there, watching, never blinking. I tried to hold on to the name Williams Morgan, repeating it silently to myself like a mantra. But every time the woman called me James, a strange feeling crept over me, a tugging, like a thread unraveling deep in my mind. Finally, they left, promising to return later. As the door clicked shut, I looked down at the hand the woman had held. My skin looked normal, but I could still feel the cold, clammy imprint of hers. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed it. The faint sound of whispers, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but I had the unshakable sense they were meant for me. I sat in the hospital bed long after the family left, staring at the bracelet on my wrist. James Emerson. The name felt like a lie stitched into my skin. I knew my name, Williams Morgan. But the more I repeated it in my head, the less it sounded right. It was like trying to remember a melody that kept slipping out of tune. The room was stifling, the air thick with a chemical tang that made me nauseous. I glanced around, taking in the pale walls, the unyielding orderliness. But something about the space felt off, like it wasn't really meant for living people. I needed to see myself, to confirm that I was still me. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The linoleum floor was cold under my feet, grounding me just enough to shuffle toward the bathroom. My legs trembled, weak from disuse, but I made it. The light in the bathroom buzzed faintly as I switched it on. My reflection in the mirror stopped me cold. My face looked familiar, but not entirely my own. There were bruises blooming on my arms, dark and circular, as though someone had grabbed me and held tight. I tugged at the hospital gown, exposing my chest and torso, and that's when I saw them. Scars, pale and jagged, crisscrossing my skin like someone had sewn me back together in a hurry. I touched one near my collarbone, wincing at the sensitivity. I didn't remember any of these. Before I could process what I was seeing, the phone by my bed rang, breaking the silence. It wasn't a normal ring. It sounded distorted, each chime drawn out like a groan. I froze for a moment, staring at the handset, unsure whether to answer. Finally, I picked it up, pressing it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, uncertain. For a second, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice, low, raspy, and deliberate, breathed into my ear. "You don't belong here. Find me before they do." The line went dead. My hand shook as I set the receiver down. Every instinct told me to call for help, but I couldn't trust anyone here. Not the nurse, not the doctor, certainly not the strangers pretending to be my family. And then the lights dimmed. At first, I thought it was just the bulb struggling, but then the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, moving like oil pooling across the floor. I backed away, my heart hammering, as they seemed to shift and twist, taking shapes that shouldn't exist. The door creaked open, and I jumped. It was a nurse, but not the one from earlier. She looked younger, with tired eyes and a tentative smile. "You shouldn't be up," she said softly, stepping inside. "Wait," I said quickly, before she could leave. "What's going on here? Why are they calling me James? My name is Williams Morgan." Her smile faltered, and she glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Keep your voice down," she whispered. "You shouldn't say things like that. Not here." "What do you mean?" I asked, desperate for answers. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the door again. "I've seen things. Things that don't add up. Records that change overnight. Patients with no histories, no families. People disappearing. You're not the first to notice." "Then help me," I pleaded. "Please, I need to know what's happening." She shook her head, her voice dropping lower. "I can't. Patients who ask too many questions don't stay here long, and neither do staff. Be careful." With that, she hurried out, leaving me more confused and terrified than before. I couldn't just sit there. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. Later that night, when the halls were silent again, I slipped out of my room. The hospital felt even stranger in the dark, the air almost weighted. I kept to the edges of the hallway, avoiding the faint pools of light cast by the overhead fixtures. The records room wasn't hard to find. The door was unlocked, as though whoever was in charge didn't expect anyone to come looking. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched into the shadows. I sifted through them, my hands trembling, until I found a file labeled Morgan Williams. My breath caught as I opened it. There, in bold letters, was my name, crossed out with a red line. Beneath it was another word, stamped in black ink, deceased. I stared at it, unable to process what I was seeing. Deceased. But I wasn't dead. I was standing right here, alive. A sudden noise from behind made me spin around. The door to the records room creaked shut on its own, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows in the room weren't still anymore. They rippled, almost like they were watching me. The air in the records room felt heavy, pressing against my skin as I stared at the words stamped on my file. Deceased. My heart was hammering, my breath uneven. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of administrative error, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The phone call echoed in my mind. "You don't belong here. Find me before they do." Whoever called, they knew something. My grip tightened on the edge of the file as I resolved to figure this out. Whatever here was, it wasn't a place I could trust. I didn't remember walking to the morgue. My legs moved almost on their own, guided by some strange pull I couldn't explain. The hallway stretched endlessly, its sterile walls humming faintly with the sound of fluorescent lights. I passed empty rooms and abandoned gurneys, the air growing colder with each step. When I finally reached the door, the word morgue stared back at me in bold, black letters. My fingers hesitated on the handle, but something compelled me to push it open. The metal door creaked as it swung inward, revealing rows of refrigerated drawers. The smell hit me first, a sharp chemical stench mixed with something organic, something that didn't belong above ground. I scanned the drawers, my eyes searching for a name I wasn't sure I wanted to find. And then I saw it. Morgan Williams. My stomach twisted, and my feet rooted to the spot. My name, my real name, it was here. I forced myself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. The drawer rolled out smoothly, revealing a body covered in a white sheet. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled the sheet back. It was me. My own face stared back at me, pale and lifeless, with eyes closed as if in reluctant surrender. I stumbled backward, almost losing my footing. The person lying there wasn't just similar to me. It was me. Every feature, every line, every imperfection. Except this version of me looked different. My body, its body, was bruised and battered, dark marks circling the wrists and neck. I reached out a shaking hand, brushing the cold, lifeless skin. What had they done to me? That's when I noticed something clutched in the corpse's hand, a key card. I pried it free, my fingers numb against the icy grip of the body. The card was unmarked except for a magnetic stripe on the back. My mind raced. A way out? Answers? Before I could think further, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening clang, the sound reverberating through the cold room. I whipped around, but the door was sealed tight. The lights dimmed, plunging the room into a murky gray. Whispers. They started softly, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voices layered over each other, words indistinct but accusatory. They grew louder, closer, surrounding me in the icy air. "You're not done yet," they hissed, the words overlapping and echoing in my ears. My eyes snapped back to the corpse. My corpse. Its chest rose ever so slightly, like it was trying to breathe. I stumbled back, clutching the keycard like a lifeline. The whispers grew sharper, almost angry now, as the lights in the room pulsed faintly, the shadows on the walls rippling like living things. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened to me, one thing was certain. I didn't have much time. I don't remember when or how I got back to my room. Back in my room, the world felt like it was folding in on itself. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the key card still clutched in my hand, its edges biting into my palm. My reflection in the bathroom mirror replayed in my head. Those unfamiliar scars, the bruises, and the morgue. My body. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was all a side effect of the anesthesia, a hallucination, a vivid nightmare I'd eventually wake up from. But then I opened my eyes, and the bracelet on my wrist still read Emerson, James. The door opened, and the nurse from earlier, the one who first called me James, entered with a tray of pills. Her smile was strained, almost mechanical. "How are you feeling, Mr. Emerson?" she asked, her tone too bright, too rehearsed. "I'm not." I stopped myself, swallowing the words. Telling her the truth had gotten me nowhere before. "You'll feel better after these," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. I stared at the pills, little capsules of distrust, then looked back at her. I remembered the name tag on the younger nurse from earlier who affirmed my suspicion. "Where's Olivia?" I asked, testing her reaction. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment. "Oh, don't worry about her. She's been reassigned." Reassigned where? The nurse tilted her head, her smile sharpening. You've always had such an active imagination. Rest now. Before I could respond, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. Minutes later, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell anymore. They arrived, the strangers pretending to be my family. The wife was the first to step forward, her smile unnervingly wide. Her hands were cold when they clasped mine, her touch stiff, like holding a wax figure. You've always belonged to us, she whispered, her voice low and possessive. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as their voices droned on about memories I didn't recognize. Places I'd never been, people I didn't know. After they'd left, then Olivia came. It was late, the hallway outside my room dim, the hospital unnaturally quiet. I was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a soft knock. Olivia slipped in, moving quickly to my side. Take this, she whispered, shoving a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. What is this? I asked, sitting up. She glanced over her shoulder, her movements hurried. I don't have much time. You're not crazy. Check the east wing, room 333. Before I could ask anything else, she was gone. I unfolded the note, her words scrawled hastily in pen. Check the east wing, room 333. The east wing. I'd never heard anyone mention it before, and I had a feeling there was a reason why. I waited until the hallways were empty before making my move. Clutching the keycard and Olivia's note, I slipped out of the room, keeping to the shadows. When I reached the east wing, the air felt different. Stale and undisturbed, like no one had stepped foot there in years. Dust coated the stretchers lining the walls, their metal frames rusted and sagging. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting uneven glows across the peeling paint and faded signage. Room 333 wasn't hard to find. The numbers above the door were scratched, barely legible. My hand hovered over the handle, hesitating for a moment before I pushed it open. Inside, the room was a mess. Stacks of yellowed files and discarded equipment cluttered the floor. I rifled through the papers, the musty smell stinging my nose. My hands stopped on a file marked Experiment 333, Identity Transference Trial. I skimmed through it, each word hitting harder than the last. They were running experiments here, on people. Patients were being subjected to some kind of soul-swapping procedure, their identities stripped and replaced with. What? The file didn't explain what happened to the originals, only that most trials ended in failure. And then I saw the name, Emerson James. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just a random name on my bracelet. He'd been one of the patients, one of the failures. The intercom above me crackled to life, its usual monotone voice replaced by something distorted and broken. At first, it was just static, but then screams pierced through, raw and agonized. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my head. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of papers, as the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. They coalesced, gathering substance until they resembled people. Their forms were hazy, incomplete, but their faces were sharp, too sharp. They were watching me, their mouths moving without sound at first. And then they spoke, their voices overlapping in a sickening harmony. You're next. I backed away, but the shadows pressed closer, their faces twisting into grotesque smiles. The intercom buzzed again, the screams rising in volume until they drowned out everything else. Clutching the key card, I bolted from the room, their whispers following me down the hall. I reached out to another room across the hall. My hands shook as I slid the key card into the slot. A small green light blinked to life, and the door clicked open. The room beyond was cold and stark, with rows of surgical tables and equipment that looked like something out of a nightmare. Tubes hung from the ceiling, and strange, bulbous machines hummed faintly. I stepped inside, the door closing with a quiet hiss behind me. A screen on the far wall flickered to life, pulling my attention. A video began to play. A man in a lab coat stared into the camera, his expression calm, almost cheerful. "Welcome to Project Renewal," he began, his voice measured and clinical. "Our mission is simple: preserve life by repurposing souls." My stomach twisted as he continued. He explained how identities were extracted, memories transferred, and bodies recycled for those deemed worthy. He spoke of failures, glitches, and the occasional irreparable damage with the same indifference as someone discarding broken tools. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over one of the tables. My mind raced as the reality of it all sank in. I wasn't just a patient here. I was a pawn in their twisted experiment. They'd stolen my life, my identity, and left me trapped in someone else's shell. Before I could process any more, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there they were, my wife, the nurse, and a few others I'd seen in passing. But something was wrong. Their faces began to shift, their skin cracking like old plaster. Beneath the surface, their flesh was gray and rotting, their eyes clouded with an unnatural glow. "You weren't supposed to find this," the nurse said, her voice deeper now, layered with something inhuman. "You've been chosen," the wife added, stepping closer, her jaw twisted unnaturally, her teeth far too sharp as she smiled. "This is where you belong." I stumbled back, grabbing a metal tray from a nearby table. "Stay away from me," I shouted, my voice trembling. They advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them lunged, and I swung the tray with all my strength, connecting with a sickening crunch. The nurse's head snapped to the side, but she barely flinched, her head rolling back into place like a puppet on a string. I bolted for the machines, grabbing whatever I could to defend myself. A heavy monitor came loose from its stand, and I hurled it at the group. It shattered against the floor, sending sparks flying. "Enough of this," the wife hissed, her voice echoing as if layered with others. They closed in, their rotting hands reaching for me. I grabbed a nearby scalpel and slashed wildly, more out of desperation than precision. One of the hands grazed my arm, its touch freezing and numb, and I felt a pull, a sharp tug at something deep inside me, like they were trying to rip me apart from the inside out. In the chaos, my gaze landed on the machines. Wires snaked across the floor, leading to a control panel lit up with glowing buttons. Without thinking, I ran to it, slamming my fist against the largest button I could see. An alarm blared, red lights flashing across the room as the machines roared to life. The humming turned into a deafening vibration, and sparks rained from the ceiling. The figures screamed, their voices warping into something inhuman as the machines began to overload. The room shook violently, the air thick with the smell of burning wires and ozone. And then I saw it, my own reflection in the cracked glass of a nearby monitor, except it wasn't mine. It was him. James Emerson's face stared back at me, his expression blank but accusing. For a moment, I felt everything he'd lost, the life he was supposed to have, the memories stolen from him. And then, just as suddenly, I saw my own memories flicker behind his eyes, my childhood, my first job, my mother's voice. Each image slipped away like sand through my fingers, dissolving into nothing. "No!" I screamed, clutching my head as the room erupted in chaos around me. The figures were collapsing now, their bodies convulsing as the machines sparked and groaned. One by one they fell, their decayed forms disintegrating into ash. I staggered to the door, my vision blurring as the world around me tilted. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice from the recording, distorted and crackling. "Thank you for your contribution." I don't remember how I made it out of that room. One moment, I was surrounded by collapsing machinery and ash, the stench of burning metal thick in my throat. The next, I was stumbling down the hallways of the East Wing, the walls trembling like they might buckle at any second. Everything felt like a blur, alarms blaring, emergency lights casting everything in nauseating red. My head pounded, each step heavier than the last, but I knew I had to keep moving. Whatever this hospital was, whatever they had done here, it was crumbling, and I had no intention of being buried with it. "Olivia," I called out, my voice cracking in the empty corridor. There was no answer, only that persistent hum in my ears and faint, disjointed whispers echoing from unseen mouths. "You'll come back. They all do." The words sent a wave of nausea through me. I didn't know if they were real or just in my head, but they felt alive, creeping into every corner of my mind. I pushed forward, clutching the wall for support. When I finally burst through the double doors into the main wing, the hospital was silent. The chaos was gone. No alarms, no rushing staff, no sign of the East Wing collapse. Just rows of empty beds and dim, sterile light. "Hello?" My voice bounced off the emptiness. Still no answer. I should have been relieved, but the absence of everything felt worse than the chaos I'd left behind. I made my way outside, the cold air shocking my senses. The night was still, the sky clouded over like even the stars were hiding. I kept walking, not sure where I was going, just needing to put as much distance as I could between me and that place. After what felt like hours, I saw another hospital in the distance. The glowing red cross on its sign was a beacon, promising safety, or at least something close to it. I stumbled through the sliding doors, my legs barely holding me up. "Help," I managed, collapsing into the reception desk. A nurse rushed over, catching me before I hit the ground. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm and concerned. I think something happened to me," I whispered. She helped me to a chair and handed me a cup of water, her brow furrowed as she looked me over. "Let's check you in," she said gently. "What's your name?" My name. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I lifted my arm to show her the hospital bracelet I'd forgotten was still there. She frowned and leaned closer to read it. Her lips moved silently as she read aloud, "James Emerson." "No," I rasped, shaking my head. That's not me." The nurse gave me a small, patient smile, the kind you'd give someone who'd lost their way. "Just relax, sir. We'll take care of you." I wanted to argue, to tear the bracelet off and show her it was wrong. But when I looked down at my hands, something stopped me cold. They weren't my hands. The skin was pale, waxy, and streaked with faint bruises, just like the corpse in the morgue. I staggered to my feet, nearly knocking over the chair. "No, this isn't right. This isn't." My voice broke as I caught my reflection in the window beside me. At first, it was my face, tired, drawn, but still mine. But as I stared, it began to shift. The eyes sank into hollow sockets. The cheeks grew gaunt, the lips thin and lifeless. It was the same face I'd seen in the morgue drawer, staring up at me with unblinking accusation. I stumbled back, the water cup slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The nurse moved toward me, but her voice was distant, her words meaningless against the noise roaring in my head. As the reflection stared back, its mouth moved. Not mine, but its. "I woke up in the wrong identity," it whispered, its voice low and broken, but undeniably mine. "And now I'm afraid I can never leave."